Miss Marple notices a mysterious woman in a bright yellow raincoat who arrives in the village during a sudden storm. When the woman is later found dead, her identity and purpose remain shrouded in secrecy. To solve the riddle, Miss Marple must uncover what the raincoat concealed and why someone was desperate to silence her. Chapter 1. The Woman by the Hedgerow. It began, as such things often do in the village of Crousage, on a morning so ordinary it might have been plucked from a calendar gray skies, a drizzle polite enough to wet the cobblestones, but not the clothes, and the smell of damp earth rising with quiet insistence. Miss Jane Marple, seated comfortably in her parlor on Church Lane, had just poured her second cup of tea, and was contemplating whether or not to mend a small tear in her gardening gloves, when the first tremor of the day arrived in the form of Dora Phipps. Dora, a sprightly widow with a fondness for statement brooches and news half-formed, entered in her usual flutter of raindrop-dotted chatter. "Jane, no, Jane, have you heard? There's a woman, yes. A stranger in a bright yellow raincoat just standing by the hedgerow near Mr. Tilling's orchard. Been there for nearly half an hour, and not a soul knows who she is." Miss Marple, ever the polite listener, did not respond immediately. She reached for a shortbread biscuit, nibbled thoughtfully, and only then said, "That does seem unusual. Jane, it's downright eerie. Yellow, mind you, not even mustard, canary, and not local, not with those boots. London, perhaps," as Dora relayed further exaggerations involving a suitcase with foreign stickers and a possible limp. Miss Marple's mind wandered not away from the tale, but inward, toward her private catalogue of human nature. People did not stand alone in raincoats without reason, especially not in villages where privacy was currency and every hedge whispered secrets. By midday, the woman was gone. The next morning, a body was found. It was discovered by Ernest Bean, the vicar's under-gardener, who had taken his usual shortcut through the copse behind the church to avoid the longer walk along Main Street. He had seen the edge of a yellow sleeve first crumpled in the thorns like discarded fabric. Closer inspection revealed a pale, lifeless hand, fingers curled as though holding something invisible. The scream that escaped Ernest was said to have echoed all the way to the bakery. The police arrived shortly after, summoned by a rattled Dora Phipps, who had been accidentally walking her spaniel near the copse. Once word spread, Inspector Grange, a stout man with a bulbous nose and a dislike for small talk, crouched beside the body. "No identification," he muttered. "Looks about mid-30s. Clothes decent. No sign of robbery." He stood, surveying the village folk beginning to gather along the lane. "Anyone recognize her?" Silence, then a timid voice. "Mrs. Clemens, the butcher's wife. She was here yesterday. I saw her outside the shop window. Didn't come in, just watched." "That matches what I heard," Dora chimed in. "She stood near the hedgerow, quiet, as if waiting for someone. Though for what, I dare not guess." Miss Marple, who had just arrived and made a modest nod to the inspector, said nothing at first. She gazed at the scene with her customary gentleness, as though seeing not a murder but the aftermath of a misunderstanding. Her eyes rested on the yellow raincoat, damp and streaked with earth. A child's toy oddly out of place lay half hidden under the bushes. A small red wooden bird on a string. She noticed the hands too, not just the right, which had curled around emptiness, but the left smooth and clean, with nails filed neatly. No rings, no calluses. A woman who had not worked with her hands, not recently. And then she looked up, past the gathering crowd, past the awnings and gables of Crousage, to the bell tower of St. Agnes. The bell had not rung in days. Later that afternoon, as villagers retreated behind lace curtains and their own theories, Inspector Grange came knocking on Miss Marple's door. "Miss Marple, may I trouble you?" "Of course," she said kindly, leading him in and pouring him a cup of tea before he could protest. Grange sighed. It's a strange one. No purse, no papers, nothing to identify her. No sign of injury either, no bruising, no wound. Doctor says it may have been poison, but he's not sure. Poison rarely leaves a calling card, Miss Marple said, stirring gently, especially in small amounts, though it can be quite efficient when mixed with the right intentions. Grange blinked. Right intentions? Oh yes, she replied lightly. One mustn't assume malice wears an obvious face. Sometimes, you know, the kindest face can mask the cruelest resolve. He frowned, unsure whether to treat it as wisdom or whimsy. She was seen in front of the old Langley property, wasn't she? Miss Marple continued. Briefly, yes, but no one's lived there in years. Still belongs to the Collingwood Trust, I believe. Miss Marple smiled faintly. The Langley place. Such memories. I remember a woman there once. Wore yellow too, but I believe her name was Isabel, not this poor soul, I assume. Inspector Grange stood. You're saying there may be a connection? I'm saying, Miss Marple replied, that Crousage has a longer memory than most give it credit for. And perhaps, so do its ghosts. He left with more questions than answers. That evening, the village seemed quieter than usual. Rain pattered once more on tiled roofs. In the drawing room of the vicarage, a fire burned, and the Reverend Humphreys turned pages of a sermon he would never deliver elsewhere. A child cried out in her sleep, dreaming of yellow birds in hedgerows and in her little cottage. Miss Marple threaded her needle through her garden glove. The rip now neatly aligned dot. She looked out the window once more, where dusk blurred the edges of the world, and she said, barely louder than the breeze, someone knew she was coming, and someone was waiting. Chapter 2. The Locked Vestibule Morning. The mystery of the yellow raincoat had fully enveloped Crousage. The villagers, always enthusiastic about tragedies that weren't their own, spoken half-whispers across hedges and under greengrocer awnings, as if the clouds themselves might overhear their suspicions. At the general store, Mrs. Brisket told young Anthony Petwell that the woman had clearly been from the asylum outside of Lidicott. Escaped, she said with relish, and wandered here. Mark my words, at the post office, Mr. Templeton was equally confident. Spy. He muttered darkly to his wife. Foreign. Probably took something she shouldn't have. But while speculation bloomed wildly, Miss Marple sat quietly in her parlor with the morning newspaper folded untouched on her lap. Her mind was elsewhere, back at the cops, back at that slight curl of the woman's hand. Something about it continued to tug at her thoughts, delicate but insistent. She had just reached for her knitting when there was a knock on the door. To her mild surprise, it was Reverend Humphreys, his hat in hand and his brow furrowed. Do come in, Miss Marple said. I was just about to put the kettle on. The vicar hesitated, stepping over the threshold with visible unease. Forgive the intrusion, Miss Marple, but, well, something strange has happened, again. She motioned him to the armchair and took her seat opposite. Strange things tend to happen in clusters, I find. He leaned forward, voice low. It's the chapel. The vestry door, it's locked. Not just latched, but bolted from the inside. And no one has the key but me. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. Has anyone been inside recently? No, not since last Sunday. He paused, fidgeting with the rim of his hat. And here's the other thing, there's a smell. A strange one. Like bitter almonds. Miss Marple's expression did not change. But inside, her thoughts sparked. Have you considered looking through the side window? I tried, he admitted. Curtains drawn, and the window latches jammed tight. I was wondering. Well, I hesitate to involve the police again so soon. No need, she said gently. Let's take a look together, shall we? The chapel stood solemn and gray against the pale morning light, its weathered stone face streaked with ivy and moss. Miss Marple followed Reverend Humphreys down the gravel path, her steps steady, her eyes flitting over every detail the way the weeds leaned as though disturbed. The shape of a shoe print half lost in the rain-softened ground. They reached the vestry door. The Reverend demonstrated its stubbornness. It did not budge, not even with a firm shove. The bolt. He murmured, "It must have been slid from inside." Miss Marple nodded, then moved toward the side window. She reached into her bag and retrieved a compact mirror. Angling it between the curtain and the glass for a long moment, she peered. Then she stepped back. There's something or someone sitting just beneath the window, slumped. Quite still, the vicar paled. "Reverend, would you fetch Inspector Grange, please? And hurry." When the inspector arrived, accompanied by a constable, and the always willing Dora Phipps trailing behind with her opera glasses, he took the situation in quickly. "Stand back," he said gruffly. "If there's someone inside, I'll have this door down." With two heavy blows of his shoulder and a splintering crack, the vestry door gave way, swinging open with a reluctant groan. Inside, the air was heavy with that unmistakable scent, bitter almonds, cloying and sinister. And slumped against the base of the bookcase, pale and unmoving, was Edwin Foyle. Miss Marple blinked slowly. "Edwin," she murmured. "I had wondered." Grange stepped over cautiously and crouched, still warm, but gone. "Who is he?" the Reverend asked, eyes wide. Miss Marple answered quietly. "Used to be the caretaker at St. Bryony's up in Tralford. Left the post suddenly, 5 or 6 years ago now. Kept to himself after. No wife, no children. Lived in the room above the antique shop." Grange rose, frowning. "Poison." Miss Marple gave the faintest nod. "Likely cyanide. The smell alone." "But why here?" Grange asked, glancing around the vestry. "And what's this?" He bent to retrieve something from the man's hand, a postcard. Blank on one side. On the other, 3 words scrawled in red ink. "She found me." The room seemed to still. Dora Phipps, standing just beyond the threshold, gave a soft gasp. "She, you don't think?" "The woman in the raincoat?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "though I suspect it's more complicated than that. Things often are." Grange folded the card, tucked it into his pocket. "Right. I'll need to speak with whoever saw him last, and someone will need to check that room above the antique shop." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the far wall where a faded painting of the chapel's founder, Bishop Whitting, hung askew. A faint draft stirred through the broken door, carrying with it the smell of old wood, damp pages, and something else. A story not yet told. That evening, as the village lit its hearths and bolted its doors, Miss Marple sat alone in her drawing room, the ticking of the grandfather clock her only company. She stared into the fire, her knitting forgotten in her lap, or to deaths, to silences, a stranger with no name, and a man with a secret he'd never managed to bury. She closed her eyes and whispered, "The chapel holds more than echoes. It always has." Chapter 3. The silent window above the shop. Following morning dawned sharp and cold, with a low mist curling around the chimneys of Crousage like a cat settling in for a long day. The village seemed to move slower than usual, the unease of recent events having settled deep into its bones. The woman in the yellow raincoat remained unidentified, her body awaiting formal inquest in a quiet corner of the county mortuary. And now Edwin Foyle, a man most villagers had half forgotten, was dead in the chapel's poison. Miss Marple dressed with care. She chose a sensible gray wool coat and a hat with just the faintest tuft of faded lilac. She pinned it on with fingers that trembled only slightly. Her morning tea sat untouched on the table as she opened her notebook, a small, unassuming thing, and drew 2 neat lines, one for the woman and one for Mr. Foyle. She wrote a single word beside each, "Unknown." Then she tucked the notebook away and made for the high street. The antique shop stood at the edge of the green, flanked by a butcher and a shuttered bakery. It was called Whitaker and Sons. though no one could recall the last time a Whitaker had actually set foot in the place. It had the stale, heavy look of a room long unswept of its memory's brass candlesticks and warped mirrors behind. Dusty glass, rows of porcelain figurines peering down from tilted shelves. Miss Marple was not here for the merchandise. "Good morning, Miss Marple," said Doris Ellis, who now ran the shop in name, if not in spirit. She was a nervous woman of 40 with thin wrists and thinner patience. "Good morning, dear. I understand Mr. Foyle lived just above?" Doris nodded quickly. "He did, poor thing. Such a quiet sort. Always down here before 8 sharp, even though no one much came in. Said he liked the silence. Did he have many visitors?" "Oh no," Doris said at once, then hesitated. "Well, there was someone. About 2 weeks ago, a lady. Odd voice, like she didn't belong. Asked for him by name." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "And what did she look like?" "Couldn't say clearly. It was raining, and she had a coat, one of those awful bright ones. Yellow, I think." Miss Marple gave a slight nod. "And she went upstairs?" "She did, yes. Stayed for no more than 10 minutes. They didn't argue exactly, but he looked different afterward, distant." Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the stairs that creaked faintly above. "Would you mind if I had a quick look?" Doris hesitated, then unlocked the narrow stairwell door behind the counter. "Of course. Police were already through, but you're welcome to it." The stairs led up into a narrow corridor ending at a single wooden door. Miss Marple opened it gently. Edwin Foyle's flat was modest to the point of austerity. One room, a fireplace, and a low table with a cracked teacup still resting upon it. A bookshelf housed a sparse collection, volumes on local church history, a well-thumbed Bible, and a curious title in German that had been marked with a torn piece of music sheet. Miss Marple took it down carefully. The sheet was old, yellowed, but something caught her attention. Not the music, but what was scrawled across the back in pencil. 935. Same pew. No hymn. She stared at it for a long moment, then replaced the book gently and turned to the window. It faced the square, but above the frame, something odd caught her eye. A faint outline, dust disrupted in a perfect circle, suggested that a small object had recently been removed from the sill. A telescope, perhaps, or a field glass. Edwin Foyle had been watching something, or someone. She stepped back into the hallway and paused by the coat stand. A faint glimmer caught her eye, a single brass button with a fluted edge, lying near the baseboard. Not of Edwin's style. She picked it up with a tissue and slipped it into her purse. By the time Miss Marple returned to her cottage, the mist had thickened, turning the village into a world of soft silhouettes and muffled sounds. She sat again by her fire and laid out her thoughts. A woman had visited Foyle, presumably the same woman found dead by the cops. She had known him, possibly blackmailed him, possibly warned him, and now both were dead. The button she found was military in design, Royal Air Corps. If her memory was accurate, not new, but polished, it would not belong to Edwin Foyle, but it might have belonged to someone else in that upstairs flat. Someone careful, someone who had reason to ensure Edwin never spoke again. Miss Marple sipped her tea and gave the fire a long, thoughtful look. "There's no such thing as coincidence," she murmured. "Only threads, cleverly hidden, and this thread, it seemed, was leading straight into the heart of Crousage." Chapter 4. The Letter and the Yellow Raincoat. Inquest into Mr. Caldwell's death was set for the following Thursday, though whispers had begun long before the magistrate summoned his first witness. Word of his demise had already passed from the bakery to the post office, from the pub to the pews of St. Mary's. It was not every day, after all, that a man dropped dead in his kitchen while his estranged daughter waited on the porch. Miss Marple, seated by the window of her parlor, knitting needles moving with rhythmic certainty, had listened to enough of St. Mary Mead's past scandals to know that something didn't sit quite right. Not that she would ever say so aloud, not yet. Her inquiries were always folded into casual questions, like the tuck of thread in a hem, invisible unless one knew to look. By late afternoon, she decided to call on Mrs. Caldwell, or rather, she allowed it to appear that Mrs. Caldwell had called on her. A small note had arrived by hand. Dear Miss Marple, if your schedule permits, I would greatly appreciate your company this afternoon. Yours, M. Caldwell. The handwriting was neat and firm, with no hint of hesitation. When Miss Marple arrived at Ashdean, the gate was ajar and the garden tidily trimmed. A young boy in gray socks and a striped cap was sweeping the front step, under the watchful eye of a stout woman in a floral smock, likely Mrs. Ludlow, the housekeeper. She eyed Miss Marple with the guarded air of someone who had already been questioned more than once this week. Mrs. Caldwell received her in the drawing room, which bore all the signs of a family home hastily scrubbed of grief. Fresh flowers in a jug, a plate of untouched biscuits, and a faint smell of furniture polish lingered in the air. Yet none of it softened the sharp lines of Miriam Caldwell's face. I thought you might come, she said, not unkindly, motioning to the sofa. I had no intention of intruding, Miss Marple replied, settling in. But I confess I've thought of you often this week. Losing a parent, no matter how estranged, is not an easy matter. Miriam gave a brittle nod. My father and I were not close. I doubt you'll find a soul in this village surprised to hear it. And yet, Miss Marple said gently, you were on the doorstep that morning. Miriam's lips twitched. Because he asked me to come, for once. I received a letter last week, brief and unusually formal. He wanted to talk. That was all he said. Do you still have it? I gave it to the constable. I imagine it's in a file somewhere, gathering dust. Miss Marple sipped her tea, watching the younger woman over the rim of her cup. And what did he want to talk about, do you think? I'll never know, Miriam replied. He was dead before I stepped through the threshold. The words were heavy with regret, but not sorrow. That, Miss Marple had noticed, was missing from Miriam's tone. There was no grief in her, only something harder, perhaps resentment, perhaps fatigue. I suppose people are wondering why he would reach out after all this time, Miriam added after a pause. He was not a sentimental man. Miss Marple allowed this silence to grow, a tactic she had long mastered, and as often happened, the silence yielded fruit. I think he was afraid, Miriam said finally, though he'd never admit it. He'd grown paranoid, perhaps. The last time we spoke, over a year ago, he told me he'd made mistakes, that some things can't be buried. Interesting, murmured Miss Marple. Miriam glanced at her. He was always vague, never apologetic. I didn't press him. I was tired of pressing. They spoke for another quarter of an hour, during which time Miss Marple asked several questions about Mr. Caldwell's health, daily habits, and whether he had any visitors in the days leading up to his death. Miriam's answers were brief and consistent. He lived alone, rarely entertained, and hadn't spoken of any illness. When Miss Marple finally rose to take her leave, she paused in the hallway, where a coat rack stood near the door. Hanging at the very back, partially obscured by an overcoat, was a bright yellow raincoat, you know. Miss Marple said conversationally, I had a similar one years ago. Quite impossible to lose track of in a crowd. Miriam turned, startled. That's not mine, no. It must be father's, though why he'd need one, I couldn't say. He hated the rain. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the coat. Curious, she stepped out into the garden, the scent of rosewood and lemon balm trailing behind her. As she walked home through the village lane, she turned over the puzzle in her mind. Mr. Caldwell had summoned his daughter after years of silence. He had spoken of mistakes and things that couldn't be buried. Then he died, quite suddenly, of what the doctor called natural causes. Though his daughter claimed he'd looked startled and afraid in those last moments, and someone, it seemed, had left a yellow raincoat behind. Chapter 5. What was heard through the hedges the following morning in St. Cramley was not one of brightness and blue skies, but of cool breezes and unsettled hush. The storm of the night before had passed, but left behind an air of restlessness that drifted through the streets like unspoken questions. At Fern Lodge, Miss Marple sat before the drawing-room window with her teacup resting lightly between her fingers. From the window, she could see the narrow path that led toward the side of the churchyard, now strewn with torn petals and scattered leaves. Something in her expression, mild as always, was tilted a fraction more to concentration than usual. Sergeant Weatherby, punctual as always when matters touched local sensibilities, arrived just before 10. Miss Marple had invited him for tea under the pretext of discussing Mr. Seddon's will. But the conversation, once pleasantries had been exchanged, turned more naturally toward the events at St. Edmund's. "You know," said Weatherby, setting down his cup with careful grace, "we've had strange things before, but never something quite so theatrical. The buttons, the bolt drawn from inside, the raincoat, all very planned." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "Some minds," she said gently, "have a flair for narrative, Sergeant, particularly when there is something they wish to divert us from." Weatherby nodded. "Well, we've ruled out burglary. Nothing taken from the vestry, though Reverend Whitaker says his liturgical diary was out of place. Small detail, but I suppose it's the sort of thing you'd notice if you write in it daily." "I dare say," said Miss Marple. "And have you spoken again with Mrs. Blount?" "Ah," the sergeant sighed. "The widow in yellow. She's a strange one. Claims she doesn't remember much about the evening, beyond helping move flower arrangements into the chapel and then slipping out quietly. Before the storm, she says she passed nobody, but Mr. Trotter saw her near the rear path, near the yew hedge. At least, he saw someone in a yellow coat." Miss Marple tapped the rim of her teacup lightly. "Did he mention the time?" "Shortly after 7. A good while before the vicar's discovery." "And where was Mrs. Fenchurch during all this?" asked Miss Marple. "She claims she was at the greengrocer's, but old Mrs. Peyton says the shop shut early due to the thunder. Said it wouldn't be safe for the boy to cycle deliveries." Miss Marple murmured, "How interesting." Weatherby looked mildly exasperated. "We have theories flying around like birds at harvest, but nothing that settles. What puzzles me most is the bolt. From the inside." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "That sort of thing tends to suggest only to possibilities. Either the person who did it remained inside and found another way out unseen, or they were never there at all." Weatherby blinked at her. "You think it was meant to look like someone locked themselves in?" "I think," she said softly, "that people often mistake the performance of a crime for the truth of it." Meanwhile, at Orchard Bank, Lillian Purdue was gathering laundry from the back line when she noticed movement at the hedge that divided her garden from the chapel's north path. The underbrush here was thick, wild, and riddled with bramble. She'd often warned the vicar it could conceal more than rabbits, but this time it wasn't a rabbit. She crouched slightly and tilted her head. Voices low. Urgent ones barely discernible except for a few clipped words. "She knows." Pause. "Not entirely." Another pause. "She's always watching. Always." Then silence. Lillian's breath caught. She knew better than to make her presence known. Years of gardening had taught her the patience of stillness, and in that stillness, she heard the rustle of movement, footsteps turning away through the undergrowth. Toward the side gate, she rose slowly, folding her arms across the basket of linen. Her brows pinched tight in thought. There were secrets in St. Cramley, always had been, but this one it felt colder than most. Later that evening, the vicar, Reverend Whitaker, stopped by Miss Marple's with a freshly baked scone from his housekeeper and a troubled look. "My dear Miss Marple," he began as she ushered him into the sitting room, I'm beginning to worry about the influence of St. Edmund's. It's as though the chapel itself has become poisoned since Gerald died. I've felt it." Miss Marple poured him a cup of Earl Grey and motioned for him to sit. "The building is not to blame, Reverend," she said kindly. "Buildings are only what we make of them. But grief, guilt, those can dwell in corners no broom can reach." The vicar seemed to deflate slightly. "It's that diary, the one I told the police about. I checked again. Not only was it out of place, it had a page missing." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Which date?" "April 3rd. And oddly, that was the day of the council meeting about the chapel renovations. The same day Mrs. Blount arrived in the village. Did Mr. Seddon oppose the renovations?" "Fiercely. He thought it vulgar, called it a desecration of memory, said the dead didn't need fresh paint." Miss Marple said nothing for a long moment. Then, "Tell me, did you happen to notice where Mr. Seddon kept his spare keys?" "He was meticulous," said the vicar. "Kept everything in a steel tin, one of those old biscuit boxes. I imagine it was in his study." "Was?" "Well, I checked. It's missing. Perhaps taken during the chaos. Or earlier. I don't know." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the storm-dimmed window. "Or perhaps it was never chaos," she murmured. "Only the appearance of it. You see, Reverend, there is a difference between a real storm and one that's carefully staged." As the vicar frowned in puzzlement, Miss Marple looked down at the delicate embroidery in her lap outside. Beyond the clipped hedges and sleeping roses, the mystery of the locked vestry whispered in the night air, and Miss Marple, with her knitting needles still and her thoughts precise, was beginning to thread the pattern. Chapter 6. The tea leaves left to Longthvi carriage drawing room was unusually full. That Wednesday afternoon, the polished tea tray reflecting a crowd of anxious faces. Miss Marple, seated modestly in a floral armchair, poured tea with deliberate slowness, her blue eyes keen behind the veil of her spectacles. Outside, the clouds clung to the hills like old secrets refusing to lift. "I still cannot reconcile it," muttered Colonel Farley, arms crossed. The woman in the yellow raincoat vanished as suddenly as she came. "You'd think someone would have seen where she went, but no one did," said Reverend Harwood, fidgeting with the hem of his cassock. "It's as if the storm swallowed her." Mrs. Nash, the housekeeper, set down a plate of shortbread with trembling hands. "I saw her plain as day standing in the churchyard, not 10 paces from me, and then—" She shivered. "Gone." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "It is often so with things one does not understand. One sees, and yet one does not see clearly." The room fell into a thoughtful silence, each mind trapped in its own fog of unease. Across the room, young Emily Tripp, niece of the recently deceased Mr. Augustus Claypool, cleared her throat. "My uncle used to say there were 2 ways to vanish in a village. One was to die. The other was to pretend you hadn't been there at all." A few people chuckled nervously. Miss Marple looked up. "Your uncle was a man of observation, Miss Tripp." Emily shrugged. "Only when it came to people's habits. He'd sit by the window for hours, watching. I suppose people are wondering why he would reach out after all this time." Miriam added after a pause, "He was not a sentimental man." Miss Marple allowed this silence to grow, a tactic she had long. The vicar gave a troubled nod. "You believe Augustus was murdered?" Emily's face went pale, but her voice was steady. "I believe it now, and I believe that yellow raincoat has something to do with it." Miss Marple took a biscuit, her hand delicate. "Tell me, dear, what sort of man was your uncle privately?" Emily hesitated. "Difficult. He liked things a certain way. He kept a ledger of village oddities. Once, I found an entire entry dedicated to how Mrs. Nash always turns her back to the window when the 4:15 bus arrives. He made enemies, more than he made friends." The ledger piqued Miss Marple's interest. "And where is this notebook now?" Emily frowned. "I've not seen it since the morning after he died. I went looking for it, but the drawer where he kept it was empty. Curious, murmured Miss Marple. Colonel Farley stood. I don't like this insinuation. The man was a snoop. Yes, but hardly worth murdering. This is all village gossip spun into fantasy. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Fantasy is often a mask for truth. We deny what we do not wish to consider. There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Nash hurried to answer it. A moment later, she returned, pale. Miss Marple, it's for you. A boy delivered something. The elderly sleuth stood and moved to the hallway. There, lying on the polished side table, was a parcel wrapped in brown paper, roughly tied with twine. No note, no return address. Miss Marple's fingers trembled slightly as she undid the string. Inside, cushioned in crumpled newspaper, were 3 large buttons. Yellow, plastic, the kind sewn on raincoats from the late 1940s. She returned to the drawing room, holding them in her palm. 3 buttons, left on a doorstep without a name. The woman in the yellow raincoat may not have vanished after all. She may have shed her identity. The room stared in stunned silence. Reverend Harwood was the first to speak. But what does it mean? Miss Marple turned the buttons gently. It means someone wishes to communicate, but anonymously. Perhaps a warning, or perhaps a confession dressed in subtlety. It may also mean that the garment in question is no longer whole or even in existence. Emily stepped forward, eyes fixed on the buttons. That coat, I've seen it before. All heads turned. In my uncle's wardrobe, she continued. Years ago. He kept it for sentimental reasons, said it belonged to someone who died a long time ago. A woman named Violet, I think. Or Vivian. Miss Marple's expression was unreadable. Was she connected to the village? I don't know, Emily said. He only ever mentioned her in a sad way. But that coat, it was yellow. And old, the same color. I'd swear to it. Miss Marple folded her hands. Then perhaps we have not been looking for a stranger in our midst, but rather a ghost from someone's past. She looked down at the buttons once more. And someone in this room knows exactly why they have reappeared. No one spoke. She looked up and smiled. I think it's time I took a walk. The weather is rather obliging, with her hat and gloves neatly adjusted. Miss Marple stepped into the fading afternoon. The storm had passed, but the storm within the village had only just begun. Chapter 7. The letter that vanished. The drawing room of the vicarage was unseasonably chilly that morning, though the embers from last night's fire still smoldered faintly in the grate. Miss Marple sat primly on the edge of an armchair, knitting needles, silent in her lap. Her eyes, however, were sharp and flinching and quietly watching as the morning unfolded. Across from her, Reverend Chiswick paced anxiously, a folded newspaper dangling from his hand. Mrs. Chiswick sat on the settee, unusually quiet, her eyes puffy from a sleepless night. Geraldine's disappearance had left the household in a state of frozen confusion, and though the police had made inquiries, the vicar's household had yet to receive any tangible news. I tell you, Jane, the Reverend murmured, almost as if to himself, there was a letter, a very odd one, arrived just yesterday morning. I left it in the vestry, meant to show it to Inspector Craddock, but when I returned, it was gone. Miss Marple blinked. Oh, the letter. He nodded. No signature. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but it warned of danger. Danger at the harvest festival. Quite dramatic language, I thought. I assumed it was the usual mischief, some young lad with too much time. But now, Miss Marple leaned forward. Did it mention anyone by name? No, just spoke of an unseen vengeance, and yellow marking those chosen. Cryptic nonsense. Frankly, Mrs. Chiswick let out a trembling breath. It was her coat, that bright yellow raincoat. Geraldine wore it to help with the deliveries yesterday. Whoever wrote that letter, do you suppose they meant her? There was a long pause. The sound of a car arriving outside broke the silence. Footsteps crunched on the gravel, and the front door rattled before being answered by Nora. The housemaid. A moment later, Inspector Craddock entered, looking tired but alert. Miss Marple. He greeted with a respectful nod. Reverend, Mrs. Chiswick, we found Geraldine's bicycle near the old railway crossing just past Haycroft Lane. No sign of her. But the bicycle had been flung into a ditch. Deliberately, we believe. Mrs. Chiswick gasped, and Craddock continued, turning to the vicar. I need to ask, have you noticed anything missing from the vestry? Or tampered with? The vicar's face went pale. The letter. I told Miss Marple just now. It's vanished. Craddock pressed his lips together grimly. We think someone entered the vestry last night. Likely after dark. Broken latch on the west window. Muddy prints. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. Might I suggest we consider not only what was taken, but what the letter signified? It warned of the festival, of danger, of yellow. Surely this connects to Geraldine's disappearance. The symbolism of the raincoat seems rather pointed to dismiss. Craddock nodded slowly. It's crossed my mind, too. But that coat, anyone in the village could have seen her in it. Yes, Miss Marple said, her fingers folding neatly over her knitting. But not everyone would go to the trouble of writing a letter unless they had a guilty conscience or an elaborate plan. There was a moment of silence before Craddock spoke again. We've also received a second letter, delivered to the police station early this morning. No return address. Same handwriting, we believe. He unfolded a sheet of paper from his coat pocket and placed it on the tea tray. Miss Marple leaned over and read it aloud. One has already been warned. Another must listen. The stain of pride will fall, and the yellow shall bloom again. All things hidden shall echo. Mrs. Chiswick clutched the arms of the sofa. That's not just a prank. That's a threat. Craddock nodded. We're treating it as such. Miss Marple rose. Inspector, may I see the bicycle myself? You want to examine the ditch. I find gardens and hedgerows are often more eloquent than witnesses, especially in the countryside. Craddock gave a slight smile. Very well. I'll have Sergeant Harris drive you there. The ditch near the crossing was narrow and overgrown. Geraldine's bicycle lay at an angle, its front wheel bent, its basket still containing two paper-wrapped parcels. One had burst open, revealing a jar of marmalade from Mrs. Cowper's kitchen. The other, untouched, was addressed to Mrs. Edgecombe. Miss Marple observed the scene silently for a long moment. Notice, she said, bending slowly to pick up a fragment of greenish wax paper from beneath a nettle, the torn corner. Not part of the parcel. It's been crushed perhaps by a boot heel. She held it to the light. This isn't delivery paper. It looks like a wrapper from Roanetree Sweets. Not Geraldine's usual choice. Sergeant Harris looked puzzled. What does that mean? Merely that someone was waiting, watching, possibly eating, possibly nervous, possibly deliberate. Miss Marple then examined the mud by the ditch. A faint indentation, nearly obliterated by the morning dew, revealed the edge of a rubber heel. Too large for Geraldine's foot, she murmured, and no bicycle track leading beyond this point. So she didn't ride away. She was taken. Craddock, who had followed them at a slower pace, stepped closer. You believe this was premeditated? Oh, yes, Miss Marple said softly. Quite theatrical, really. A costume yellow raincoat, a warning, and now a disappearance staged beside a broken bicycle. And 2 letters? That's not panic. That's performance. She turned back toward the road. Inspector, we mustn't wait. Someone is building toward something using symbols. There may be another act to follow, and I fear the audience has not yet seen the final curtain. As the inspector stared into the trees, a thin wind rustled the leaves. It carried with it the faint echo of chapel bells, silent for years, but perhaps not for much longer. Chapter 8. The tea leaves of suspicion. The following morning, the village of Aldenham awoke under a blanket of fog so thick that even the sharp steeple of St. Luke's Church faded into a blurred silhouette. It was as though the world itself was uncertain, hesitant, as clouded as the minds of those still puzzling over the curious disappearance of Mrs. Redley. And the enigmatic woman in the yellow raincoat. Miss Marple took her tea by the parlor window, watching the mist coil through the hedgerows like cautious fingers. She stirred a lump of sugar into her cup, eyes narrowed in thought. Something still did not sit right with her. A woman disappearing just after a brief confrontation in the vestry. A yellow raincoat so brazenly visible yet untraceable. And those 3 buttons in her embroidery bag. Why had they drawn her attention so forcefully? Across the village, at the vicarage, Reverend Coulter had just finished leading a strained morning service, attended by a handful of villagers. The pews had felt colder than usual, as though uncertainty had slipped between the hymn books and settled into every line of the Lord's Prayer. Even Miss Levis had stumbled while reciting the psalm. Sergeant Chudla had taken over the investigation from the distracted constable, and though earnest, he remained a man of simple thinking. His attention had settled firmly on young Alec Redley, who had by his own admission argued with his mother the evening before she disappeared. "He stands to inherit everything," Chudla muttered to himself as he pored over a rough list of statements, jotted hastily in his notebook. The boy was seen leaving the chapel in a hurry that night. Disagreement. Money. Classic motive. What the sergeant missed entirely was that Alec, for all his aloofness, had spoken of his mother with a peculiar mixture of frustration and fondness. A son grieving in quiet disarray, not scheming in cold calculation. But Miss Marple, who had long mastered the delicate art of listening between words, noted this subtle contradiction. Later that day, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Tilling, the housekeeper of the chapel, under the pretense of discussing a charity jumble sale. They shared tea and a plate of thick ginger biscuits, and it wasn't long before Mrs. Tilling began speaking of the strange details she'd noticed. "I swept the vestry myself that morning," she said, her hands curled protectively around her teacup. "Before the vicar's early service, there was nothing there but the usual things: cassocks, Bibles, a loose bit of twine. But after the commotion, you saw something different?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Tilling nodded. "Just a scent at first, something odd, like lavender and rust. Then later, when I went to collect the hymnals, I found a smudge on the floor, brownish, near the edge of the vestry carpet. I thought it was just boot mud, but it didn't dry." "Did you say anything to the vicar?" "Oh no, he's already flustered as it is. I just dabbed it up with vinegar water." Miss Marple made a mental note. Lavender and rust, a peculiar combination, and a smudge that might be more than just mud. Blood, perhaps, disguised in the half-light of the vestry. But the real question was, where had the body gone? She excused herself shortly after, her mind buzzing. She wandered to the chapel, finding the heavy wooden doors unlocked. The interior was cool and hushed, bathed in the pale gray light of the day. She stepped quietly through the nave and into the vestry. Where she paused, the carpet had been cleaned, but the faint outline of the smudge remained a darker patch, just visible against the threadbare red wool. Miss Marple knelt, inspecting the weave. Yes, something had stained it, something iron-based. She was sure of it. She rose slowly and turned her attention to the coat rack. Hanging neatly was the vicar's own heavy wool overcoat, a scarf, and curiously a beige raincoat with one sleeve folded oddly. She examined it but found nothing unusual. Then she stepped out into the adjoining storage closet, the one that led behind the altar. The door creaked slightly, and she blinked into the dimness. Rows of dusty props and altar cloths were stacked on uneven shelves. Her eye caught something torn fabric, a scrap of yellow wedged behind a wooden chest. She reached for it. It was indeed yellow nylon, the corner of a rain hood, crumpled but clean. Someone had hidden part of the garment here. But why only a scrap? She tucked the fabric into her pocket and quietly left, that evening, under the pretext of a knitting circle meeting. Miss Marple invited a small group to her cottage. Mrs. Tilling, Alec Redley, Lucy Fotheringay, and the ever-present Miss Levis. The fire crackled gently as tea and seed cake were passed around. Conversation, as expected, turned to the ongoing mystery. Miss Levis had developed a dramatic flair for speculation. "I wouldn't be surprised if it was an affair," she whispered. "Women in yellow coats don't go visiting churches for spiritual reasons, I dare say." Lucy looked affronted. "You assume quite a lot, Miss Levis. A woman's wardrobe does not dictate her intentions, nor her morals," Levis retorted. "Ladies, please," Miss Marple intervened with a calm smile. "Perhaps we must consider if the woman in yellow never left, and Mrs. Redley never returned. Might it be the same person?" A stunned silence followed. Alec frowned. "But my mother was wearing green that morning." "Olive green wool, indeed," said Miss Marple, stirring her tea. "And you said she had that coat for years, sturdy. But I remember something else. Your mother was once quite fond of bright things until her husband died." Alec's eyes narrowed. "What are you saying, Miss Marple?" "I'm saying, perhaps she wore yellow once, and perhaps someone wanted us to believe they were to women when, in fact, there was only one. Someone changed the outer garment to cause confusion, perhaps after death." Miss Levis gasped. "Good heavens! But why?" Lucy asked, her brow furrowed. Miss Marple set down her teacup. "That, my dear, is what we must uncover. And I believe the answers lie not in what was worn but in what was removed." She looked down at her own knitting basket, where 3 mismatched buttons still sat in a glass jar. One black, one mother of pearl. One yellow. She turned to Alec. "Did your mother ever sew her own clothes?" "Rarely, but she mended obsessively," he said. "She hated things looking unkempt." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Then if one were to find a coat missing a yellow button, or a dress missing a mother of pearl, we may be closer than ever to understanding who left that chapel and who never did." The fire flickered. Outside, the fog was lifting. Inside, the truth was just beginning to take shape. Chapter 9. The Truth Behind the Veil. Miss Marple sat quietly in the vicarage drawing room, her knitting untouched on her lap. Outside, the drizzle had returned, tapping gently on the windows as if nature itself were hesitant to interrupt the quiet unraveling of secrets. The events of the past week, the death of Miss Edith Cotterill, the mysterious figure in the yellow raincoat, the torn hymn book, and the vicar's strange evasions had stirred a deep intuition within her, though the final thread still eluded her grasp. Reverend Giles came in bearing a silver tray with a teapot and 2 cups. His movements were deliberate, his composure studied, like a man trying not to reveal the tremble in his hands. "I must say, Miss Marple," he offered with a tight smile, "the village has certainly taken to speculating. One might say it's the devil's weather for gossip. People only speculate, dear Reverend, when they sense something being withheld from them," she replied softly. "It creates a vacuum. Nature and villagers abhor a vacuum." He poured the tea without replying. Miss Marple took a sip, then spoke again. "It's a curious thing about Edith Cotterill. Her death has been ruled a tragic accident. A stroke, I believe the doctor said. And yet, I wonder if one ever really dies of a stroke in the middle of reading aloud Psalm 52. The tongue deviseth mischiefs. At a chapel gathering she herself organized, with a trembling hand clutching a torn page, the vicar's eyes met hers. "Are you suggesting something, Miss Marple?" "I never suggest, Reverend. I observe. I noticed, for instance, that Edith seemed unwell at the last Women's Fellowship meeting. Not ill, per se, but nervous, distracted, almost fearful. And then there's the matter of the vestry. Locked, I'm told, since Tuesday." A flicker of discomfort crossed Giles's face. "I simply hadn't the chance to tidy up properly," he said too quickly. "I'd meant to organize some boxes of old parish records. Records? Miss Marple's tone was light, but her eyes were sharp. Would those include the handwritten confession papers for the wartime donation fund? Such meticulous records were kept, I understand. A matter very close to Edith's heart, I believe. The vicar paled. Those documents were no longer relevant. Old grievances and misunderstandings. Forgive me, Reverend. But Edith Cotterill was not one to let go of grievances. She was many things, but forgetful was not one of them. There was a long silence. The rain whispered like a secret at the window. She threatened me, he said at last, his voice hollow. She said if I didn't come clean about the missing funds from 1944, she would expose me. To the bishop, to the papers, anyone who would listen. But it was never meant to be theft. I used the funds to help a refugee family resettle. I was young, foolish, and I returned every penny with interest. But Edith did not forgive. Miss Marple said gently no. She wrote it all down in that little red notebook of hers. I saw it in her handbag the day she died. But afterward, it had vanished. Vanished, Miss Marple echoed, her fingers twitching over the untouched knitting. Later that evening, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Edith's cottage once more. Constable Rowntree, who now held the keys, allowed her a brief look around. The parlor remained untouched, yet something had shifted. The neat rows of books now bore subtle gaps, and the embroidered cushion on the armchair had been turned inside out. In the hallway, Miss Marple paused at the umbrella stand. There, among the usual assortment, was a yellow raincoat, dry, folded too neatly for a garment recently worn in stormy weather. She looked to the constable. Was this among the items catalogued after the death? Rowntree scratched his head. Can't say I noticed it before. Curious, Miss Marple murmured. Curious indeed. The following morning brought a surprise visitor to Miss Marple's cottage, Mrs. Sarah Hemming, a once genteel woman now fraying at the edges, like the hem of her tattered gloves. I must speak with you, she blurted before even sitting down. It's about the yellow raincoat, said Miss Marple, setting her tea aside. I rather thought it might be. It was mine. I lent it to Edith 3 weeks ago when we met for a walk. But she never returned it, I see. And yet, she never mentioned borrowing it. No, Sarah whispered. Because she didn't walk with me, I lied. It was Beatrice Parham who borrowed it, though she never meant to keep it either. But then the news of Edith's death came, and she asked me to say I had lent it instead. Why? Because Beatrice was seen near the chapel that evening. She hadn't told anyone she had gone there. She'd argued with Edith a few days prior over something about her late husband's will. Edith had accused her of forging a letter. Beatrice was terrified people would think she'd returned that evening to confront her again. Miss Marple sat in silence. Then she nodded. Poor Beatrice, always a little too proud and a little too careless. But she did not kill Edith. Sarah's eyes widened. Then who? Someone who had access to the vestry. Someone who knew of Edith's red notebook and feared what it contained. Someone with quiet keys and a quiet motive. The final pieces of the puzzle fell into place that evening, when Miss Marple requested an audience with Inspector Dorridge, who had grown increasingly impatient with what he termed village theatrics. I trust you'll indulge me a moment. Inspector, she said, producing a small, water-damaged book from her handbag. The missing notebook, found behind the parish donation box in the vestry, tucked in so hastily it slipped behind the wood paneling. Dorridge opened the cover. Inside, in Edith Cotterill's sharp script, were detailed notes on the wartime donation accounts, including a final, damning entry dated the week of her death. He told me he repaid it, but I checked the ledgers. The amount was never restored. Are you saying the vicar lied? He asked. Miss Marple's smile was faint. No, Inspector. He believed he had repaid the money, but the records had been falsified by someone else. Someone with access to the church books in the late 1940s. Someone who later feared Edith's investigation. And who would that be? Miss Letitia Barnard, Miss Marple said calmly. The vicar's former secretary. She kept the accounts while he was away on retreat. She made quiet alterations. When Edith began inquiring into the missing years, Letitia acted. She lured Edith to the chapel under the pretense of helping her prepare for the reading. Slipped something into her T digitalis, I suspect. Then tore the damning page from the Bible and replaced it to mislead. Letitia? Dorridge repeated, stunned. Double quotes yes, and afterward. She donned the yellow raincoat to remove the notebook, thinking no one would question a figure seen in a storm. Letitia was arrested quietly. She offered no resistance, only a soft whisper as they led her away. I only wanted to keep it buried. It was so long ago. Miss Marple watched from her window as the police car disappeared down the lane. She sighed, her needles finally resuming their gentle clack. Time doesn't always heal, she murmured to herself. Sometimes it only delays the reckoning. Chapter 10. The sound the rain forgothed village of Belchester awoke the next morning, beneath a low gray sky, the kind that seemed to remember the storm from the night before, but refused to weep over it. At the vicarage, the air hung thick with tension. Reverend Stedman's tea had gone cold beside his untouched toast, and even Mrs. Partridge was uncharacteristically quiet as she cleared away the tray. At the center of it all sat Miss Marple, composed as always, fingers gently knitting a new line of pale blue wool. She was not there for morning tea. She was there because she had requested that all relevant parties gather. Inspector Cray had obliged with wary curiosity. Elspeth, her eyes tired from sleeplessness, sat beside Judith Hargreaves, who appeared somewhat more alert than she had in days. To one side stood Constable Bell, stiff and dutiful, and in the far corner, at the window, looking out as though wishing she could vanish into the lane, stood Mrs. Evangeline Moore. A hush fell as Miss Marple laid aside her knitting. I asked you all here, she said gently, because I believe the time has come for truth. Inspector Cray leaned forward. You have something to share with us, Miss Marple. She nodded once. Yes, Inspector. I believe I know who killed Mr. Francis Lenwood, and I also know why. No one breathed. Elspeth gave a strangled gasp, then covered her mouth. Judith reached out and placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. Miss Marple folded her hands on her lap. I must begin with the vestry door, the locked door. Cray asked. Yes, she replied. When Elspeth heard the faint cry and rushed in, the door to the vestry was bolted from the inside. Yet Mr. Lenwood lay on the floor, already dying if not dead. That, of course, created the illusion that no one could have entered or left. A classic locked room conundrum. And yet, such puzzles often depend not on what is locked, but on who is assumed to be absent. She turned her head slightly toward the widow in the corner. You were the first on the scene, Mrs. Moore, or rather, you claimed you were. Evangeline stiffened. I found Elspeth sobbing outside the chapel. I told the constable the same, you did. But the difficulty is, Mrs. Moore, you were not seen by anyone entering the chapel, nor leaving it. That proves nothing, not on its own, no. But allow me to go further. Miss Marple rose slowly and walked to the small round table near the window, picking up the yellow raincoat that lay draped across the back of a chair. This coat, she said softly, is at the heart of it. Several villagers saw a woman in a yellow raincoat leaving the chapel just before Elspeth arrived. It was raining heavily, and the figure kept her head down, but the coat stood out. At the time, it was presumed to be Elspeth until she herself said she had not yet entered. She paused, letting the silence stretch. I initially thought perhaps someone had borrowed it disguised themselves, but then I recalled a small thing, the label inside. It reads property of Belchester Ladies' Club, lost and found. It wasn't Elspeth's coat, nor yours, Mrs. Moore. It had no owner anymore. but it was kept in the hall cupboard of the chapel, among old theatrical items from last year's summer fair. And you, Mrs. Moore, knew it well. You donated it, if I'm not mistaken." Evangeline's fingers gripped the curtain at her side. "That doesn't prove anything, no," Miss Marple said again. "But the buttons do at this." She held up her hand and revealed 3 mismatched buttons of yellow enamel and cracked ivory, lined in tarnished brass. These were found behind the choir stall, pressed into the groove where the floorboard meets the wall. Not lost recently, mind you. 2 of them had been stepped on, cracked. That's why the raincoat was missing its middle fasteners. Inspector Cray frowned. "But if they were dislodged during the struggle," "They weren't," Miss Marple cut in gently. "They were pulled off, deliberately, because someone was in that coat who did not want it recognized later, and someone who needed to remove it quickly after the deed was done." She looked again at Mrs. Moore. "You slipped the coat on over your clothing, entered the vestry while Mr. Lenwood prayed, and confronted him. No one saw you. You knew his habits. You had seen him take confessions there for years." Evangeline's voice came out ragged. "He was a hypocrite." "Yes," Miss Marple said calmly. "He was." That silenced the room. Even Cray blinked. Miss Marple turned to face the others. "Mr. Lenwood used his position to coerce and shame. He kept secrets under the guise of forgiveness. What he held over Judith Hargreaves about her son. What he threatened Elspeth with spreading rumors about her mother's supposed affair. But you, Mrs. Moore, he tormented with knowledge far more personal." The widow let out a hoarse cry. "He knew your husband had died not in peace, but in anguish because of what Lenwood himself had done in the past. A swindling of church funds, covered up by the vicar. And your husband, his junior at the time, took the blame. The guilt consumed him. It nearly destroyed your marriage. And still, Lenwood thrived, admired, untouched." Mrs. Moore's voice cracked open. "He smiled. When he saw me at the Christmas luncheon last year, he smiled, as if none of it mattered, as if suffering left no mark. And so," Miss Marple said gently, "you marked him." The silence that followed was long and heavy. "I went to confront him," Evangeline said quietly, "only to demand he clear your name." She nodded at Judith. "To confess what he did to your son. But he refused. Called me a bitter widow. Said no one would believe me." Her hands shook. "I had the candlestick in my hand. I hadn't meant—" "No," Miss Marple interrupted softly. "You hadn't meant to kill. But you did." "And the locked door?" asked Inspector Cray, barely above a whisper. "She waited," Miss Marple answered. "Waited inside, in the shadows behind the curtain partition, until Elspeth arrived. Then she emerged a moment later through the side corridor, hidden by the coat, slipped into the hall cupboard, and returned to Elspeth, now breathless, panicked, but appearing to just arrive. That brief delay gave her time." Cray ran a hand through his thinning hair. "You're certain?" "Quite." There was a stillness. Then Evangeline Moore turned and, with tears silently falling, extended her wrists to Cray. "I'll go," she said, "but I don't regret it." "Not truly." Cray hesitated, but at Miss Marple's solemn nod, he stepped forward. The arrest passed without fanfare. Belchester, in its peculiar English way, absorbed the news with gossip-laced tea and furrowed brows. Some wept, others whispered that Evangeline had simply snapped, as women of her age sometimes did. But a quiet majority said nothing at all. 2 days later, Miss Marple sat once more in the rose garden, her shawl wrapped tightly against the breeze. Judith joined her, her face lined but steadier. "I still can't believe it," she murmured. Miss Marple sipped her tea. "You believed it when she stood to defend you." "Yes, but I never imagined it went so far." She was tired, Miss Marple said, of silence, of watching men like Lenwood thrive while others suffered. Judith was quiet for a moment. "And Elspeth, she'll be all right," Miss Marple said. Youth heals faster, though the scars remain. But she is brave. They sat in companionable silence a while, the wind teasing the edges of the garden. Judith turned to her. How did you know? Miss Marple smiled. The buttons, my dear. Always the buttons. Women never lose 3 at once unless there is urgency. And when I saw the coat in the cupboard, I saw the uneven repair along the lining done recently. By hand. She set down her teacup. And besides, I have learned that the most respectable women, those who bring sponge cakes to church socials and write notes on scented stationery, are often the ones who carry the heaviest burdens or the oldest debts. Judith gave a half smile. And you, Miss Marple, what burdens do you carry? Miss Marple leaned back, her eyes far away now. Only memory, my dear. But memory is enough.